celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our subject today is the status of law in America, and we particularly would like to emphasize the status of law schools and what is going on in colleges of law around the country. We could not be more fortunate than to have the distinguished guest we have today to discuss this important topic. I welcome to the program Dean John Clute, who is the Dean of the College of Law at Gonzaga University. Our distinguished guest holds a baccalaureate degree and also a doctorate of jurisprudence from Gonzaga University, and he was a counsel to Boise Cascade for 26 years before recently becoming the Dean of the Gonzaga Law School. Dean Clute, welcome to the program. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
I'm very pleased to have two graduates of the College of Law at Gonzaga University to be the panel today. They both are attorneys in the state of Idaho. First of all is Janelle Burke, who serves as the law clerk to the administrative judge of the 1st Judicial District of Idaho. And next to her is Bob Brown, who is in private practice. And I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Dean Clute, you've had a distinguished career in private industry, and now you're involved in the legal education field. How do you feel that the young people might want to go into the field of law? Do you think that's a good thing for them to do? And if so, why?
Well, I think it's a very good thing, and the reasons will differ, of course, by individual to individual. But I think generally you can say the representation of lawyers in the legal profession on the media, movies and TV help. You don't see very many programs on doctors these days, but you see an awful lot on lawyers, and that sort of romanticizes. It's not an accurate picture, but at least it's something that attracts students and causes them to think about it. I think the avalanche, if you will, of regulations and laws that come out seem to say to a lot of people that if you have a legal education, you're going to be better able to cope in society today. And you can also make changes if you happen to disagree with some of those laws or the effects of those laws or the absence of the right laws in the books. So you can be an agent of change if you're an attorney. And I think it is also a way to make a very good living if you are a good attorney. So for all those things, I think the legal profession attracts people.
Is it necessary to be in the practice of law if you are a lawyer? Do people do other things as well as be practitioners?
I think they do a lot of other things. I believe the practicing bar is probably the ideal for most law students, but I think you can work for government agencies in a regulatory situation. You can work for courts, as you do. You can work behind the scenes. You can simply use the legal knowledge that you have to help run your own business or to help you become more successful in whatever line you do decide to enter.
Now, what kind of preparation would you suggest for a young person who wanted to go into the law? What particular fields, if any, would you suggest, or do you think that just a general background is helpful?
I'm a firm believer in a liberal arts education, and I think that's the best possible preparation someone could have. If they're more technically inclined, then I would say accounting or business. But a liberal arts education is the best practical, best possible background.
And by that you're talking about perhaps English or maybe political science, history?
English, history, political science, art, music, anything just to get a very good, well-grounded education.
Bob Brown.
Dean, when I first became interested in going to law school in 1965, the classes were made up of many people who looked just like me, that is to say, white males. What changes have you noticed since you, say, went to law school yourself, which is about the same time period that I would have been going the first time? What changes have you noticed in the makeup of the student body in terms of women, minorities, and so forth?
It's become much more diverse. At Gonzaga, for example, 39% of our student body are women. And the minorities, we have 37% of people of color of one cultural background or another. I think, first of all, that it enriches the school. I think it enriches the education someone gets because of all this different variety. And I think it's good for our society. It certainly, the legal profession is an area where women probably have more opportunities than just about any other profession, with maybe the exception of medical or something of that nature. But I think it helps those of diverse cultural backgrounds, because all the demographics say that the white males are going to be in a distinct minority situation in the not too distant future. And I think those who are going to then be in the majority need the education, need the background, need to have those that they can turn to with the same cultural background to assist them.
You mentioned the TV shows when you were answering the first question about the interest in law. Do you think that shows like LA Law, which feature the women attorneys, the different cultural background, do you think that has been a positive, even though they're romanticized in terms of the law, as we all know, do you think that they've been a positive influence for attracting these kinds of students to the law schools?
I think it's been a very positive influence. It helps to have a role model. That's one reason why we try to diversify our faculty, make sure we have cultural diversity represented there also because of role models. But it is a highly romanticized version of real life.
Dean Clute, I want to deal with a practical and technical question about law school. Later I want to get into some of the status of law in the country. That intrigues me, but we have some political science and pre-law students in the studio today, and others out, I'm sure, in the audience, the viewing audience. Could you walk us through what one would expect in 3 years of law? I've heard many times that the first year is the same for everyone, and then there's some choices second, third year. If you could just give us somewhat a summary, that would be helpful to those that may be deciding if that's the path they would take.
Surely. First of all, it's 3 years. That is the normal full-time term. It's a very rigorous curriculum that they're challenged by, and it requires an awful lot of study. In fact, law schools still, I think, pile on too much, and it's sort of the survival of the fittest to a certain extent, in the sense of just coping with the volume. But the first year is a set curriculum. It usually, at least at Gonzaga, is 15 credit hours per semester, so that's 30 credit hours. And there's no choice. It's the same courses for everyone. The second year is probably about 60% required courses, and between 30 and 40% electives. And it becomes a little bit more diverse at that time. And the final year is probably almost all elective courses, although there is some that perhaps would be required if they didn't take them in the first 2 years. I think someone can expect some very long study hours, some very difficult courses. They might as well realize at the very beginning that for 3 years they're not going to have much spare time. Makes it also enjoyable though when they graduate.
And then upon graduation from the law school, of course, there's the bar exam, which is another frightening experience, but one that's essential to practice law. And there's some preparation that one can get outside the 3 years of law in preparing for that exam, is there not?
Yes. There's no substitute just for a review of all the courses you've taken and self-study, but there are organized review courses for the bar examination, and we recommend that every student takes those, because it's a hefty investment to go through law school anywhere these days, and it's 3 years of time, and so you shouldn't skimp, if you will, by not doing everything to assure that you get your license, which passing that bar exam requires. But you can take the bar review course, and that helps. Study is the most important thing, though.
Janelle Burke.
I want to flesh out a little bit what Tony was talking about, but in terms of information for our viewing audience as well, lawyers generally do not specialize as they go through school. They may, however, take classes in interest areas. This is somewhat in contrast to the medical profession, where a person may specialize in an area. Do you want to comment on that generally?
Well, there's a lot of discussion in legal education circles these days about specialization and just the time constraints that you have in a 3-year course to become fully competent in the skills and the subjects that you're expected to be competent in as an attorney. And there's even some thought that you should have an apprenticeship, sort of a residency like the medical profession has, after graduation, but so far there hasn't been a lot of support for that, although conceptually it's a good idea. But it'll just add another year or so to your education. Most people cannot afford that, nor do they want to do that. I think the specialties almost have to come later. Now that can come either by getting a master's degree in a particular area like taxation or environmental law or natural resource law, or it can come by going with a law firm that is either small enough so they specialize in one field or large enough so that you can specialize in a particular department and then gain your expertise in a specialized field that way.
Another question that I have is with regard to theoretical versus practical experience. In law school, for the most part, lawyers are learning the theory rather than where the courthouse is and how to file the papers. Would you want to comment on that?
Well, you have to have the theory and you have to have a good grounding and a broad base of legal courses, but you also have to have some professional skills training. And the American Bar Association, the Association of American Law School is now requiring more and more skills training. And at Gonzaga, we have one of the oldest legal clinics in the United States. It was founded back in the early 70s when it was sort of state-of-the-art, pioneering effort. And their students get a very intensive opportunity to handle live clients and get some practical experience as well as doing some good, because these clients of our clinic at least tend to be those in impoverished circumstances or disabled or something of that nature, elderly.
The final question in this series that I have has to do with bar examinations. An attorney is licensed in a particular state, although this is in somewhat a state of flux, but one cannot simply be licensed in Idaho and then go practice anywhere in the United States. Would you wish to comment on that as well?
I've always thought that it would be well to have some sort of national bar exam that each state would adopt or at least give full faith and credit to another state's licensing arrangements for the bar. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of sentiment for that. I think the legal profession tends to be a little bit competitive in the sense that they wish to protect their own turf. And of course each Supreme Court, as a general rule, controls their own state bar, and so there's a little bit of jealousy and a little bit of tendency to want to maintain their own standards.
Bob Brown.
We all know that in any educational setting, not all education takes place in the classroom. I'd like to move out of the classroom now. When I was at Gonzaga, there were a number of student activities that were available to students. One of the ones that I became involved in was the William O. Douglas lecture series that Gonzaga sponsors. And I thought that was an excellent opportunity to bring home some elements of the First Amendment and to expose the students to some national speakers. I was absolutely delighted, and I'm wearing two hats today as the member of the Idaho Art Commission. We were just delighted to hear that John Fornmeyer had accepted the invitation, I believe it's this coming fall,
Yes, it
to
is.
speak at Gonzaga. And I just wanted to congratulate you for that and have you comment, perhaps using that as a springboard for student activities in law school at Gonzaga, that sort of thing, like the William O. Douglas.
We have a very active student bar association and student body. I think there's many avenues like that which they can supplement their education and get just very valuable experience. The William O. Douglas lecture series is entirely run by the students, and I think their choice of speakers has been great. Last year we had Morris Dees from the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama, and it was just a tremendous experience, both for anyone who could come and particularly for those students who arranged it and were able to interact with him and the logistics of getting him here and everything else. So there's lots of practical experience. We have a minority law caucus, a women's law caucus. We have legal fraternities, the Student Bar Association itself, which is the overall student government. And we have the, besides the William O. Douglas lecture series, we have the Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday celebrations, which is a whole series into itself of special events. So I think our student activities are many and varied, not least of which are all our moot court competitions, which not only build skills in a professional way, but give them the opportunity to compete against other schools and go to regional and national competitions.
Do you anticipate any difficulty at all having, I know that over the past speakers for William O. Douglas, there have been some that have thought to be maybe somewhat controversial. Do you anticipate any controversy with John Fulmer coming, or do you know
I
that
don't
yet?
believe so. I think he represents a point of view, and if university can't invite speakers with diverse points of view, they aren't necessarily endorsing them one way or another, and I think that's what a university is all about.
Thank you.
I too would echo Dean Clute, the absolutely outstanding programs you have. I was there last year in the Martin Luther King Jr. part of that program, and you moderated a panel that was just outstanding. I'd like to get into a little issue of what's happening to law in America. We hear that every day on the street, and there's a lot of discussion about our court system and if it moves too slowly in dealing with cases, and we hear a lot about regulation. We have too much, or you hear from other people that there's areas that law really does not adequately address. I just have a wide open question for you. Based on those comments, what do you consider the status of law in America in really two parts, I suppose? One is, are there areas where we need to address more legislation, and are there areas where that we are sometimes bogged down in the legalities of regulation?
I guess I should give a disclaimer. The views I'm going to express
Sure.
are mine and not necessarily Gonzaga Law School or our faculties. But I personally believe that we have too much intrusion of law into our private lives, and I think that if anything, we need less law and less regulation than what we have today. By the same token, there doesn't seem to be any trend in that direction. If you just count the number of laws that come on the books each year, and compare those with the number of laws that may go off the books, there's just no comparison at all. It's all one-sided. And I think the court systems are bogging down. I think justice delayed is in fact justice denied. I think that the great trend to consider alternate dispute resolution represents a failure of our normal system. I think the idea of putting more and more people behind bars and keeping them there, I don't agree with that. I don't know a solution to it, but I think there should be more effort made to find a solution, to find an alternative to imprisonment. I do not agree with all these mandatory sentences where sentencing is taken away from the discretion of the judge. I don't think that's the right way to go. So I could go on and on because I could get on a soapbox on that.
Well, you've been very, very much to address the question in a very eloquent way. That brings up a second part of what that came to me from your answer, and that is that I have talked to a number of people in the legal field, judges and attorneys and all, who are very involved in conflict resolution centers or dispute resolution, and you indicated that part of that was because of what had happened in the courts. What do you see for the future of that approach? Does it have promise, and will it have a major role to play with the courts in dealing, for example, like in domestic law?
I think it's going to have to, because the fact is the delays in just getting into court, on a lot of cases, that adds to the expense, that adds to the frustration, it adds to the mental stress of any kind of situation in the business world. Even a wrong decision is better than having to wait 5 years to get a decision. And so I think the cumulative effect of all that says that you're going to have more and more of these alternative dispute resolution types. And again, it represents, to a certain measure, a failure of the system. But I think that's what people are just going to be forced to do.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Dean Clute, some people believe that there are too many lawyers. In recent years, there has, of course, been a greater number of people who've gone into the profession. What do you respond to them when you hear that kind of criticism?
I think the number of lawyers, to a certain extent, is directly attributable to the number of laws. And if we can address the first issue, then we may be able to have fewer lawyers. I think the market for lawyers is going to be self-regulating. Right now, the market, with all the lawyers that are graduating, surprisingly, most all of them are finding jobs, and good jobs. If you looked at what happened to PhDs in the early 70s, the market corrected that. Everyone was getting a PhD degree. That was the terminal degree of choice. Now, to a certain extent, it's the law degree. And if people cannot find the kinds of jobs they want with their law degree, they will no longer choose to become lawyers. And so I think it will self-correct.
What do you say in response to people who are talking about that when we compare with other countries that have fewer lawyers? There are some countries who do have really relatively few lawyers compared with the United States.
I think the first thing that I would say to that is let's reform some of our procedures. I think product liability reform is something whose time has come. I might not get agreement with on that issue either with some of our faculty, but that's my personal opinion. And I think if you can reform some of those types of laws and some others I could name, that you would not have the necessity for as many lawyers. But as long as those kinds of processes go on, we'll have more and more lawyers.
Would you agree, though, that all of us are rather protective of our own turf, and when it happens to be us who have been wronged, then we want to have the system address that? And when it's someone else's problem, of course, we would want to cut down on the number of regulations that there might be. Does that happen, do you feel?
I think it happens a lot.
Bob Brown.
Speaking of the new regulatory laws, one of the ones that will probably have the greatest impact on our country in its history is the new ADA, American with Disabilities Act.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, as a student at Gonzaga Law School who trudged up and down the many steps and stairs that connect that building, I was wondering, A, I know you have some plans for a new law school which you might want to mention, and B, what effect will the ADA have on a building like the Gonzaga Law School?
Well, the Act says that you must make reasonable accommodation, and there are certain standards as to what constitutes reasonable accommodation, and we have already taken some steps, and we will take some others. But unfortunately, you cannot rebuild a building as old and as complicated as our building to accommodate all sorts of disabilities, which we would like to do. So I don't see a major effect upon the law school. We're going to have to do some things, but the reasonable accommodation standard, I think, will permit us to do what we can do, but not do things that are extraordinary and things that just wouldn't make sense.
Will this new law perhaps spur the efforts toward a new law school building that would be have better accommodations?
We wouldn't want to have a major campaign for a new law building simply because of that, but that's a contributing factor, and we haven't determined the financial feasibility of whether we can or cannot plan on a new building, but my personal goal is that we need one. Our facilities are certainly adequate, but they're inefficient because we're in 3, soon to be 4 buildings, and communication is very difficult, traffic is very difficult, accommodation for those who are disabled is very difficult, and so we could solve all those problems to a great extent with a new facility. And the fact is our facility has seen its day, and it is an old facility, and a new law building would be welcome.
Dean Clute, I just want to take advantage of your expertise, and as someone who teaches in the area of constitutional law, I'm intrigued with what is happening at the moment in relation to constitutional rights. We all know the U.S. Supreme Court has become far more conservative in the last few years and has a much more narrow interpretation of the Bill of Rights. But some states, such as Oregon, Washington, New York, have state Supreme Courts that are much more liberal in their approach. And so many of those states are, and I know you know this, but I'm giving the background for our viewers, are moving to interpret their state constitutions more liberally than the U.S. Constitution. Do you see this as a temporary trend? I'd like to get your reaction to that whole process. Or will we move more and more to where individuals' rights might vary from state to state depending on the state Supreme Court and the interpretation of that state constitution?
I do believe that the state constitutions are becoming more and more important, and I think we are considering right now a state constitutional course in the law school. We can't do it this year, but we're going to consider maybe doing it in the following academic year. And I know Justice Utter of the Washington State Supreme Court, who happens to teach a state constitutional law course at University of Puget Sound Law School, is very much an advocate of that and would agree that the action to a certain extent is shifting more and more to state courts and the interpretation of state constitutions.
I was particularly bringing that up because the Chrisman case in the state of Washington, at Washington State University, where the defendants lost before the U.S. Supreme Court and came back to Washington and went under the state constitution that search and seizure protections are more extensive. So it could be what one might describe as a precedent-setting case for this particular approach that I mentioned.
Could very well be.
Janelle Burke.
I have a series of questions, again, small questions that deal with various areas of the law as it pertains to now and also in the future. There seems to be a shift toward very large law firms and urban areas, but there also are still attorneys practicing in relatively small firms in rural areas. What do you see as being the trend of the future? Do you think we're going to have mega firms all over the country?
I think you will have mega firms all over the country, but I think you will find many smaller private practitioners, either individual or in small firms. I think you will have a balance between the two, and you'll have those middle-sized firms too. It's like the business world. You have the mega manufacturing firms, but if you really look at where the jobs are provided all across America, it's the small firms that provide the jobs. And I think it's going to be the same in the legal profession.
Another thing that's changing is the availability of electronic research for lawyers. Has this changed the whole field of law, the availability of the whole world at your fingertips just on a keyboard?
I think it has to, one thing, it makes being in private practice and as a sole practitioner much more economic because you have access to a library through a relatively modest subscription price to one of the commercial services. So it makes that feasible, whereas in the past you either had to be awfully close to a county law library or a university law library or something of that nature, or you were pretty well shut out because you had to have access to the legal books. But now I think that's coming much more economically available.
What about people in our community and throughout the inland northwest here? What can we do at GU? We can come over and use the law library if we want to, isn't that correct? To attend some of your
we maintain
special
it
programs?
as a public service for anyone who needs to use it and everything. We're glad to help out.
And it's relatively user-friendly, too, in terms of being able to find things, isn't that correct?
It's like everything at Gonzaga. We're all user-friendly.
On that note, we're going to bring the program to conclusion, but you also have a new public information center and library that's going to be remarkable, and I know that all of the Spokane and surrounding areas are very proud of that, and we congratulate you for all those developments. But on behalf of the panel, I want to thank you, Dean Clute, for a most informative program, and you've been very generous with your time.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you found this program extremely informative, and I again want to thank our guest, Dean John Clute, who is the Dean of the College of Law at Gonzaga University. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss what we believe to be a significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.